policy direction at some points. So, we have seen all over Latin America, going back to the Cold War years and before, problems with security forces that abuse human rights with impunity. We, in our border work, which began around 2011, have unfortunately seen a lot of cases of human rights abuse with impunity here within our own borders as well. And we wonder why. But we start here by sort of just collecting examples in a database. And we struggle to keep it up, to be honest, because unfortunately there are many examples of human rights violations. But if you go to a place called borderoversight.org, you can find this catalog of really disturbing things done by Border Patrol and CBP at the border, usually, but not always, with migrants as the victims, organized by type of abuse, by geography, by victim. And this is a hard one. By the last accountability action taken, what was the last thing done to make sure there was an investigation and some kind of consequence? That just starts, that database starts in 2020, and we have more than 400 entries and a pile that are still to be entered. But along the border, there's really just a handful of organizations that are doing similar monitoring and issuing complaints and keeping track of the human rights situation at the border. A lot of that is because our organizations that are, say, shelters or service providers or attorneys, they have a lot to do, and sometimes they're doing it in really unsafe conditions. But if you look at our database, a large portion of what is registered there is in the Tucson sector, Border Patrol's sector in Arizona. And that's not necessarily, can't say for sure, but not necessarily because the Border Patrol agents in that sector are somehow worse. It's that there is somewhat better coverage from groups on the ground, especially the Kino Border Initiative, who was the recipient of WOLA's Human Rights Award in 2018. There in Nogales. We were so delighted when Zoe and Joanna agreed to work on this report with us that we're launching today. I'm going to hand off to Joanna as director to talk more about what things look like on their end and their work.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you all for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to collaborate with WOLA on this report, and as another piece of our long partnership with the organization. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Kino Border Initiative, we're a binational Catholic organization. We work in 3 different dimensions: humanitarian assistance and holistic accompaniment, education, and advocacy. So in other words, we try to respond to the immediate needs and realities of migrants, and we also try to do education and advocacy on both sides of the border, so that we can reach a world with migration with dignity, where we don't have to exist anymore as an organization. So migrants arrive to our services on the Mexican side of the border in Nogales, Mexico, because they need food, or they need shelter, or they need clothing, or medical assistance, or information. And that's really the entry point for people. But from that space, we listen very carefully to them and to their experiences and think, how is it that we can join with them in fighting for a better world? And specifically when it comes to this complaints work, we started it in 2015, and there were 2 main motivations. Before we started doing the specific work on complaints, we were already doing abuse documentation as an organization. So we'd already published a report, or 2 reports at that point, documenting trends of abuse at the border, but especially by Border Patrol. And what we heard in those spaces and other advocacy spaces around abuse is DHS and CBP telling us that this information wasn't actionable without specific and timely complaints. So we as an organization decided to take them at their word and turn in specific and actionable and timely complaints, in one way to give us another channel of advocacy, and this in part to figure out what were the accountability processes from an insider view of going through it day after day, and how is it that we can make that more functional. So that was one thread of the motivation for our complaints work. And then the second thread was really our deep respect for migrants' voices and agency. The people that we receive who've been in Border Patrol custody, many of them deported after a couple of days in custody, or maybe they were subject to some criminal consequences program and were held in detention for months before being deported. In that time, they've experienced a variety of abuses, and they never had an opportunity to have that heard, to file a complaint, to express what they were frustrated with. until they arrive to KBI. And if we didn't do this work, and as they move out to other places in Mexico or other parts of their journey, they might not necessarily have a place where they can complain after coming to the Kino Border Initiative. So we really saw that unique niche of we're a place where they can be heard, not just by our staff, but where we can help them to be heard by agencies. And that's really important for the people who are arriving here. Some of them arrive saying, I've experienced this physical abuse. I just want this to be denounced in some way. And the complaints can be a conduit for it. Other people, of course, arrive hesitant about the idea of complaining. They're concerned about what might the consequences be for me in the future. Is this really going to make a difference? And we have to be honest and say we don't actually think that this will make much of a difference, but we're not going to stop trying, and we're going to continue to try year after year. And I think really that migrants' choice to complain is an act of solidarity with their brothers and sisters that are coming after them. They know that the complaints will bring almost no chance of personal benefit for them. And we're very clear with that from the front. And they say, well, maybe me using my voice and exercising my agency might make a difference for the next mom that comes here with her kids and is in short-term detention. Maybe they'll listen to her and give her medical attention or give her kids diapers because I took my action. Or maybe this will make a difference for the next man who's out in the desert who isn't resisting arrest or anything, but maybe then there will be less use of force against that person. So their choice to lift their voices, their choice to sign a form and say, yes, I consent to this information being shared specifically with my details with DHS and with CBP. So a real act of courage and an act of faith that our system can bring accountability. And so we think that our role as KBI is to support that and make that hope perhaps into a reality through pressuring the agencies to do something with that act of courage and not to just leave it in a complaints layer. So October 2015 is when we started, when I filed my first complaint. I was started at KBI in the summer of 2015. First complaint filed in October of 2015, which was a use of force complaint. A Border Patrol agent pushed down this individual in the desert against a rock, and it ripped his tendon, falling on the ground hard onto the rock, ripped his tendon in his knee. And then the Border Patrol agents forced him to walk 25 meters to the truck to then be detained on his with his injured knee, and the whole time making fun of him, calling him a fucking bitch, and in other ways, exhibiting verbal abuse towards the individual. And then once he got into custody, didn't give him immediate medical attention for his injured knee. And he was the one that motivated me and us to start this complaints process because he wanted his voice to be heard. And so some ways, 8 years later, this report and this webinar is a legacy of his act of courage. At the time, we used the channels that were most logical to us. We weren't experts at complaining at the moment. I wasn't an expert at complaining. So I thought, well, it seems logical to file the CRCL form, and it seems logical to go onto the CBP website and fill out the form that they have on their website. Those are the most publicly accessible, public-facing complaints. I didn't know how to work the system. Turns out that complaint went nowhere, and for reasons that will be described in the report. But that was the beginning of our journey into the web of accountability agencies, in which we learned the tricks of the trade of who do you need to reach out to very specifically in order to get that complaint addressed. If I filed it today, I would have called OPR and said, I'm not going to wait for this to go through the whole thing. I need this to be raised to your alert right now. Of course, if we weren't a professional complaints filing agency at this point, then we wouldn't know that. So in July 2017, we filed, we took a summary of the complaints that we'd filed up until now and the accountability actions and published a report called Intake Without Oversight that I believe is linked to in this report. And 6 years later, now we're taking another look at what has happened with these years of complaints and what does the accountability structure look like. Again, with the hope that we can honor the courage of the migrants who are choosing to believe that a better world is possible and to believe that they could be treated with dignity and respect while in custody. And so that's our act of faith. And today we're sharing a little bit about what we're seeing as a result of those complaints. So I'll pass it back to Adam to add that detail.
Yeah, Joanna, thank you for that. That was so important to emphasize sort of the credibility of the accountability process within the Department of Homeland Security. It's got to be credible for migrants who suffer an abuse to come forward and feel that they're not wasting their time, or that you're not wasting your time as an organization along the board that's trying to advocate for them. But it's also important that it has credibility so that an agent who may generally be a good person, but perhaps having a bad day, will not commit an abuse because they believe there's a real probability of having a consequence if they do so. Right now, I think that what our report really concludes pretty strongly is that that credibility is not, it doesn't exist right now. The system is Byzantine and works against it. So looking at our report, we divided it into 4 sections. And I know it's a long report. There's a lot of examples, some of them very painful examples, trying to illustrate what's going on, but also a lot to talk about, a lot to recommend. The first section talks about establishing the problem. It shows that we do, even in the present day, have a chronic human rights problem within CBP and Border Patrol. The second section just tries to explain what this complicated accountability process looks like. The third, judging, drawing very heavily on KBI's experience, talks about where the failure points are, where these cases, once they enter this accountability system, often simply just die or stop and without accountability being achieved. And then fourth is a very long section of recommendations, which I'll talk about at the end. I should clarify that our purpose here is to talk about this system and the incentives that it creates, and not at all to attack agents as people or as a profession. We're not assuming that these are inherently bad people who all got recruited and now need to be somehow, reframed or retrained. These are probably good people, but there's a lot here going on about institutional and organizational dynamics that sets up a lot of incentives that lead to stories like the one that Joanna just told us. So, those who, if we're talking about a system with those committing abuse getting a few consequences, section 1, again, there is a serious human rights problem. There are serious or fatal cases. Our report just since 2020 names 13 fatal cases, most of them use of force, some of them neglect in custody, that raised big flags for us. There are other fatalities that we didn't all include, but you can read about those 13 cases, including just since May, the death of Anadith Benay-Reyes in an 8-year-old migrant girl in Harlingen, Texas, or the shooting death of Raymond Mattia outside his home in Tohono O'odham land in Arizona. Other serious woundings or injuries, like the case of Marisol Garcia Alcantara there in Arizona, who was shot in the head as she sat in a car and then deported before even talking to investigators. But there's also many other categories of abuse and unprofessional behavior that while they don't necessarily rise to the level of a fatality, do show that there is something going wrong culturally. A lot of things that happen, like Joanna was just telling us, upon the moment of being arrested or apprehended. A lot about conditions in custody, people being denied food, water, medical care, having their access to counsel blocked, abusive language, including abusive language with children, a lot of shoving and kicking while people are in custody. Families do still get separated, although usually now it's not parent and child, but it's close relative and child, or husband and wife. Way too much, and this has been an issue in Arizona, non-return of belongings, confiscation of people's documents. Sometimes people's documents get falsified and they get sent just off to a shelter in a city that they don't even know. Dangerous deportations, sending parents and kids into dangerous Mexican border cities in the wee hours of the morning. A lot of civil liberties and privacy infringements, including involving US citizens and journalists and activists. Problems with discrimination and harassment, including within Border Patrol and CBP's own workforce, as well as racial profiling, sexual harassment and assault, discrimination and aggression against the LGBTQ community, and a constant problem of insubordinate, or you could call it sort of highly politicized conduct among the workforce that seems to be tolerated. Being insufficiently distant from militias, for instance, or repeating anti-migrant talking points while on duty. A classic example in 2019 was a Facebook group that was revealed to have some very horrific things shared by much of the Border Patrol workforce. And that's important if you just think about, we had this indictment come out last night with a lot of detail about how people who were trying to deny the result of an election were talking openly in the White House about using the military and other U.S. security forces for a political end, to enforce what they were trying to do politically and align them with one party or one political tendency. When professionalism falls apart and its politicization kicks in. We saw a little bit of this with Border Patrol being used in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, and it is a latent danger. So that insubordinate or highly politicized conduct issue is another one that we have to continue to keep an eye on. I just gave you almost a rather boring, laundry list of kinds of abuse that, if you look at our database, are still awfully common along the border. They tend to take two pathways toward accountability. The first, if it's a really serious, high-profile case, local police or CBP's Internal Affairs Division will initiate the investigation on their own. I mean, it's big, it's public, people know about it, it's fatal, and they will initiate an investigation. That investigation may not move fast, but at least it starts from the inside. Most cases, especially that long list of categories I just named, usually in those cases, you would have no investigation. No one in the inside would even know about it if it weren't for outside actors. In this case, in many cases, KBI in Arizona, victims, their advocates, were taking the first step themselves. It's that second path to accountability of having outside actors work, which is what we're looking at here. But even there, as Zoe is about to tell you, it remains pretty frustrating.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Adam and Joanna for starting us off, and thank you all for being here. As Adam said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these specific complaints that we filed from Keno Border Initiative, from KBI, reflecting abuses that are likely happening daily, but abuses that we would maybe never know about if it weren't for the bravery of migrant people themselves coming forward, as Joanna explained, and wanting to create an official complaint around their experience. So we're very grateful to all the migrant people who have come forward and who have shared with us. So I'm just going to start with two examples. There are many examples in the report and on WOLA's database as well. But two examples of what the complaint process was like for two people that KBI was able to accompany in the complaint process. So I'm going to start out, thank you. I'm also going to show up here just to give us an idea of where these abuses are maybe taking place, where these human rights violations are taking place. So here we can see we're situated at the De Concini Port of Entry that's in downtown Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona. And I'm going to talk first about Carlos. KBI filed a complaint on his behalf on November 4th of 2020. And we sent this complaint to the Department of Homeland Security Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So we've talked a bit about CRCL. We're going to throw some acronyms out. But CRCL is an office, an accountability office that's charged with taking complaints of any violations of civil rights or civil liberties. And Carlos arrived to KBI and shared with us a little bit about his story. He is a Guatemalan national, and he was apprehended by Border Patrol in the desert. This was after he had been forced to work for an organized crime group in northern Mexico for about 6 months. He was not able to pay the extortion fee they were asking to pass through that section of the desert, and was therefore kidnapped and forced to labor for 6 months. He finally was able to escape. He was apprehended by Border Patrol agents, and he explained to them that he was afraid to return to Mexico for that reason. And the agents said to him they would decide whether they would send him back to his native Guatemala or to Mexico. They ended up expelling him to Nogales, Sonora, Mexico at 2 a.m. agents were unloading him and other migrants at the Deconcini port of entry. And one agent in particular said, "¿Dónde está el pendejo?" Where is that idiot? Referring to Carlos. When Carlos tried to ask the agent why he was being expelled to Mexico if he's a Guatemalan national, the agent responded by raising his baton at the ready and threatened to hit Carlos in the head. The agent then brought down the baton and struck his knee, causing it to swell. Carlos thought his knee was broken and could barely walk. So in summary, this complaint outlines many different experiences. Carlos was deported in the middle of the night after he had been recently kidnapped and trafficked in Mexico. He was ignored by agents when he tried to express his fear. And instead of channeling him to an asylum officer, the agents responded with physical and verbal abuse. So we filed this complaint in November of 2020. And we received the first communication about this case on August 15th, 2022, nearly 2 years later. A staff member from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties sent us an email and said they had received an investigation done by the DHS Office of Inspector General, which is another accountability office. The staff member wanted to locate Carlos and talk with him. He stated that the Office of the Inspector General reported they were unable to locate Carlos, which was one of the reasons that they couldn't prosecute in the case. And so the staff member asked if KBI could help locate Carlos. But unfortunately, this was 2 years after the fact, and we were no longer in contact with Carlos. I responded to the staff member and let him know we did not have contact any longer. And we then received another communication that said the Office of the Inspector General investigated, and they then referred the complaint within the Department of Homeland Security. It followed, "You can contact the Office of the Inspector General for more information." And so as I'm trying to understand more about the accountability process, I responded and asked, how could we find more information? How could I know the outcome of the investigation? And the Office of Inspector General staff member responded that we would have to file a Freedom of Information Act request to know the outcome. And my final follow-up question was, what if Carlos himself reached out to your office? He was the one who filed the complaint, who experienced this abuse. What if he wanted to know what happened in the investigation? And they responded, he also would have to file a Freedom of Information Act request. So in summary, I think this case shows various failure points, as we're calling them, examples of how complaints don't lead to sufficient accountability. So one thing we see in this case is how complaints are often passed between different accountability offices. And that's because they have overlapping responsibilities in many ways. In this case, it resulted in a delay of nearly 2 years until we heard any update about what was happening. In this case, Carlos, the person who filed the complaint, was never interviewed. He was never spoken to as part of the investigation. And OIG, the Office of Inspector General, never reached out to Carlos himself. He was never made aware of the status of his complaint, of the outcome of this investigation. So that lack of transparency and lack of responsiveness to the complainant is also really concerning. I'll share one other example, like I said, among many. And this example takes place in the Sonoran Desert, as we see pictured here. We can imagine many of these human rights violations happen in remote areas where maybe other people are not there to witness what happens. And it's, as we've said, only due to the courage of people who then come forward that were made aware. This case is about Silvia. We filed a complaint on her behalf on August 4th of 2021. Silvia is also a Guatemalan national. She was only 20 years old at the time. She was walking through the desert when 2 Border Patrol agents on 4-wheelers started to approach her. One of the agents on his vehicle hit her leg, and the impact threw her to the ground. Her whole ankle and lower leg were swollen for many days. She was then taken to Border Patrol custody, but never received any medical attention for her injuries. And it wasn't until she was later expelled to Nogales, Mexico, that she was finally able to receive pain injections and then physical therapy for the injuries that ensued. In this case, we filed the complaint to both the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, as well as Customs and Border Protection's Office for Professional Responsibility. We did receive the next day an email from OPR that gave a case number for this complaint, and the case number corresponded to CBP's Joint Intake Center, which is yet another tool used to take and organize complaints. After that initial response, KBI has not received any further communication about this case to this day. So we are not aware of if there were any further actions taken. And again, to reiterate some of the failure points we see illustrated, the complainant in this case, Sylvia, also was not interviewed as part of any possible investigation. And we see again the lack of response and the lack of transparency that KBI nor Sylvia is aware of where this complaint currently is, if it's still under any sort of investigation, or if it has simply been closed. So reflecting on these examples, if this is our experience at KBI as an advocacy organization who's been doing this work since 2015, as Joanna explained, we've since learned a lot about how to navigate these offices. We've developed personal contacts in different accountability offices, but yet still our experience overwhelmingly is that we do not receive responses. We're not made aware of any investigations or other accountability outcomes. So I can only imagine what it would be like to try to navigate this system as an individual migrant person alone, without the accompaniment of an organization with the kind of experience we've accumulated. Where would you even begin? What office do you approach? There are 4 different accountability offices with 4 separate forms, 4 separate internet portals. So I'll talk a little bit about what this looks like. We tried to visualize it as well to help us understand where these different offices live. So overall, we're looking at the Department of Homeland Security. On the left-hand side, we have 3 offices that are within DHS. And then we also have an office and some mechanisms within Customs and Border Protection, which is a component or a sub-agency of DHS. But I'll briefly talk through these offices. So we do have the Office of Inspector General that was involved in the first case I talked about. And they're charged with investigating allegations that show systemic violations, such as abuses of civil rights, civil liberties, racial profiling. And importantly, the OIG has what's called right of first refusal for complaints that are sent to either CRCL, that we see reflected here, or that are sent to CBP OPR. So that means that the OIG has to first look at those complaints and decide if they are going to do their own investigation. If they decline, then they send the complaints back to the original office, and those offices can investigate. So that ends up being a really common failure point of we maybe receive an initial communication that a complaint is being forwarded to OIG, and then we do not hear anything back after that. That's something we see pretty commonly. I'll also add that OIG has criminal investigative power, which is not necessarily true of all of these offices. Going down the chart here, we also have the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman. This is a newer office, and they're charged specifically with looking at conditions in DHS detention. So this could be Border Patrol custody or detention, ICE detention, etc. They will take individual complaints, use more of a case management model, and they also do unannounced inspections of detention centers to look at conditions. We also have the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, CRCL, and they do a few different things. They take individual complaints related to abuses of civil rights or civil liberties. They store complaints in a database they have, and they analyze patterns of abuse to make policy recommendations to CBP or to other sub-agencies within DHS. And then on the other side of this chart, we are looking within Customs and Border Protection. The Office of Professional Responsibility is their kind of internal affairs accountability office, which also is tasked with many responsibilities. such as allegations of employee corruption, criminal and administrative misconduct, use of force, deaths in custody, and detention standards, among other issues. And OPR also has criminal investigative power. And then I also alluded to briefly the Joint Intake Center that's run by CBP-OPR, which is another tool, kind of the central clearinghouse for receiving complaints. So this is a bit of the overview of what these current 4 accountability offices are. And it brings us back to the question of someone has a civil rights violation they've experienced by Border Patrol or CBP, where do you go? Which one of these offices do you file a complaint with? And there's a lot of overlapping responsibility. A lot of these offices are tasked with looking at the same thing or similar things. And we see complaints passed back and forth a lot. At Kino, as we've been doing this over time, we try to send complaints to all of the offices that could possibly look at it, that could possibly have responsibility. But even then, in the vast majority of complaints, there is no outcome that results in investigation or discipline. So lastly, I'll briefly overview. We, in this report, looked at the complaints KBI. This is my beautiful chart. The complaints that KBI has filed between 2020 and 2022. And in that time, we filed 78 different complaints. And I tried to categorize them by last accountability outcome that Adam alluded to. What's the last thing we heard? What's the last thing that happened in this complaint? And so I've highlighted here in yellow that 95% of the complaints in that time frame resulted in no investigation and no disciplinary action. So at least that KBI is aware of. And there are many different ways that this happens. So some of these categories here outline different failure points or different examples of where these cases just kind of fall off the radar. So to briefly explain, 35% are recorded in usually CRCL's database and there's no further action taken. It's a very common response we would get to a complaint. 25% of the cases, KBI receives some sort of initial acknowledgement. For example, maybe an office lets us know they will forward the complaint to another office, such as OIG. But after that initial acknowledgement, we don't hear anything else. We also receive closure letters citing the complaint is closed because there's ongoing litigation related to something in the complaint, or that CRCL or another office has created recommendations around this issue in the past. This is another challenge because CRCL and other offices don't have a way to enforce their recommendations. They can publish recommendations for CBP or other agencies, but we don't have a way to know if CBP has concurred, has made any efforts to implement these recommendations. There's also a chunk of complaints, 10%, where we receive no response at all. There's no acknowledgement of the complaint, no initial steps that we're made aware of. And there are also complaints that are closed because in the investigation, the office says they could not substantiate the allegations or they determined the policies were not violated. This category is also concerning because we know in many cases the complainant themselves is not interviewed. It's common for the offices to find that they could not substantiate the allegations. And then we have that 5% there, which out of 78 cases, this represents 2 cases where there was some sort of accountability outcome. So there was a case that resulted in recommendations, but it's not clear whether CBP concurred or agreed with these recommendations. And there was also one case where the agent in question was referred for disciplinary action, but we're not sure what that action was or any steps that were taken to make that reality. So overall, there's a really slim chance of accountability that we see based on the complaints KBI has filed. And as Adam talked about, this is a part of what allows these human rights abuses to continue occurring, because there are not currently sufficient consequences for officers or agents who do participate in these human rights violations. And it's a really complex issue that we believe needs to be tackled from multiple angles. And that is why a bulk of this report is the recommendations section, which has over 40 recommendations. And we look at recommendations in various areas. So improving the complaint intake process that I outlined, of trying to get more clarity on the jurisdictions of these offices, trying to streamline the intake process so that migrants themselves and advocacy organizations aren't battling to understand where to turn to. Also to improve the investigations of the complaints, to make these more robust investigations, to interview the people who experience the abuse themselves, for example, as well as strengthening discipline for agents who do violate human rights, trying to take on the organizational culture within CBP, which is in many ways resistant to accountability, and also to get more congressional support for oversight and for the use of appropriations to increase accountability for DHS. So I'll leave it there. We can put the screen back to normal. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Adam to talk us through some of the recommendations.
Thank you, Zoe. That's so frustrating, isn't it? I mean, just this whole effort to get these complaints moving and then to get so little result. The recommendations are, how can we change this? I mean, there actually has been quite a bit of change in the last 8 or 9 years. All of those agencies in Zoe's chart are bigger than they used to be. For the most part, they have more faculties than they used to, but we're still not really seeing the results. So 1/3 of this report, more or less, is recommendations, which it's not just a laundry list, do this, do this, do this. We actually are explaining what needs to change and why. And we've been talking about this lately in a round of meetings with congressional staff in the lead up to the release of this report. Yeah, I mean, Zoe just named a few of these, but just to go over, I'm not going to go over all the whole third of the report, just some of the highlights here. Obviously, the intakes have to be easier. Somebody who's suffered an abuse or somebody who's accompanying them, if they're not, as experienced as KBI, the intake process has to be easier. They shouldn't have to know which agency to go to, whose nuance is more apt or more appropriate for their particular complaint. In an ideal world, there would be a common form. The agencies, all of those agencies within DHS that do accountability should be able to handle hybrid complaints. What if, for instance, attorneys who are interviewing unaccompanied children hear a lot of stories of abuse in custody and write a letter with many, many examples? The agencies right now would have trouble trying to parse that apart, decide who does what, follow up which one. What they call hybrid or sort of glued apart complaints don't often move just because there are so many and they're not set up for it. Another thing that is badly needed is just some sort of deconfliction process between all these agencies when their mandates overlap. There is actually a management directive going back to like 2004 within DHS that is supposed to govern this, but the agencies have changed and it badly needs updating. That is something that Biden administration people said that they're looking at doing, but the process is not moving very quickly on Management Directive 810.1. Making feedback better is a huge one. I can, if I order something from Amazon right now, I'm going to know when it got to every UPS distribution center and when it's on the way to my house, but I can't go to a website with some password and find the last step taken on my complaint. The complaint may have just gone into the memory hole and I have no way of finding that out. Frankly, in our work on Colombia, post-conflict Colombia, the victims unit of the Colombian government is more responsive and more able to give current information on where victims' cases are there than DHS is here in the United States. And as Zoe was saying, I mean, the Inspector General having the right of first refusal, I'm going to sit on this case until I decide whether I want to take it or not with no time limit. And if I don't want it, then finally I'll hand it back to OPR or CRCL or whoever it is. That right of first refusal, if they have that, there at least has to be a shot clock, some kind of time limit on that so that OIG can't keep the case for months while precious investigative time is lost. While we're talking about DHS's Inspector General, the current Inspector General, Joseph Ghaffari, just There was news about him last week. He had to just pay a $1.2 million settlement to somebody who was a whistleblower within the organization who he was intimidating, but he's been in trouble for many other things in the past couple of years. Look at all of the work that the Project on Government Oversight has done about his tenure, including a podcast that they did earlier this year. DHS is too important to not have an inspector general who's really effective and who is keeping the organization at a state of high morale and high efficiency. And we're not there right now. It's bad. It is good that Congress has given enough resources to DHS to increase the personnel strength of the Office of Professional Responsibility. They're hiring right now, and that is good. They're finally going to be up sometime in the next year or so to the level that a CBP Integrity Advisory Panel had recommended almost 10 years ago. It is urgent, though, that they don't only hire investigators from within CBP, that they bring in people from other disciplines with other training, other points of view, and especially that they don't just interview people who were part of the CBP, the teams, the CITs that were too often involved in covering up crimes. Investigators from all agencies must actually interview victims. Doesn't sound like something we should have to recommend, but it does not always happen. It's gotten somewhat better, but there are still cases. It was at least weeks, I'm not even sure if it's happened yet, since some of the relatives who live near Raymond Mattia in Arizona were actually interviewed. Body-worn cameras are making a big difference, and they should continue to be distributed as quickly as possible and the sharing of footage is important. Disciplinary decisions we found tend to be easily overruled or softened, even when a recommendation for strong discipline is made. It then goes through a whole other digestive system that the report talks about that often keeps the discipline from being meaningful. DHS Secretary Mayorkas, I know his plate is full, but he did promise reforms to the disciplinary process in early 2022, but nothing has come of it. We have recommendations for Congress that they be more willing to ask questions, including in hearings about some of these abuses. I would just give a shout out to Congressman Garcia from California, who recently did ask some questions about some incidents happening in San Diego. There should be more pressure on CBP to get required reports out in a timely manner. It would be great to see a new report, for instance, on internal investigations and employee accountability. The last one out was in April 2022. Congress should also, and they often are, but more members and committees should be willing to assist when some of these complaints and specific cases get stuck. So, okay, there's a lot more recommendations in the report, and I'm not going to keep going on that. Please read it. You can read the report by just going to WOLA.org, WOLA's main website. And it's right now, of course, linked from the main page, but the report is the same title as this webinar, Abuses at the US-Mexico Border, How to Address Failures and Protect Rights. You can find that there. And of course, this webinar's live stream will be on WOLA's YouTube page, which I believe is WOLA Latin America at YouTube. And it's under, if you click live, you'll be able to see this video. So, organizational cultural change is sort of what we're talking about here. And that's a slow process. But there's a lot that can be done without waiting for legislation, from our deadlock Congress to do things. A lot of that is laid out in the recommendations of our section, which have some legislative recommendations, but most of them are things that the executive branch can do on their own, that Congress and even we as citizens can do on our own. The credibility of the accountability process really depends on victims believing that pursuing a complaint is worth their time and effort. And an accountability process that consistently fails to provide consequences and redress, that ends up re-victimizing victims. And I'm afraid that's where we are right now. I'll hand off to Zoe for some final reflections.
Thank you so much. Just in conclusion, it's unacceptable that 95% of complaints that we had filed in that 2-year period didn't result in any investigation or disciplinary action. And as Adam spoke to, we think about the impact this has on people who have experienced these violations and who have not received any update on the complaint that they filed. And so I just wanted to close briefly because, we were talking about complaints from 2020 to 2022. I had a chance to sit down with someone on Monday of this week who wanted to file a complaint. He is a dad traveling with his 17-year-old son, and they're trying to flee southern Mexico. Border Patrol agents forced them to sign return paperwork to go back to Mexico without listening to their fear or channeling them to any asylum officer. While also explaining to them at the same time, the agent stating Mexico really isn't that dangerous. You should just go talk to the police, obviously not understanding the kind of situation they're fleeing from. So I briefly explained to them the complaint process, that filing the complaint is obviously very important because it's official documentation of what they experienced and official documentation of Border Patrol violating their right to an asylum process in this case. But I also explained that likely there will be no personal benefit to them. Likely we'll receive no specific response, maybe other than a letter template saying, thank you for sending the complaint. We have recorded it in our database. So I explained this to the father and he said to me, no te preocupes, estamos acostumbrados a la falta de justicia en nuestro país. He said, don't worry, we're used to the lack of justice in our own country. That was his immediate response to me. And so my final reflection is, this can't be the standard that we accept. We must and we can do better. And we need a US-Mexico border that is well governed, that treats migrants and asylum seekers with respect, and that provides clear and effective pathways to accountability when people do experience these human rights violations. So I'll close with that. I have many more examples, but the report is full of them.
Thank you, Zoe. And because I am an incompetent moderator, I don't think that I mentioned at the beginning that if you have a question, you can click on Q&A here in Zoom, which is right there at the bottom, and type in a question. And I thank the two people who figured out how to do that on their own, but feel free to do the same because we do have a good 15 minutes or so to talk about addressing questions. One is from Wendy Fry from San Diego, who asked, has DHS or CBP or Border Patrol provided any response to the report in general, or any of the findings of this report shared with them ahead of publication? We talked quite a bit with CBP OPR and went back and forth with CRCL, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, as we worked on this. And a lot of their insights were really important for us to know what did and did not pass the LAF test. We have not, in the last sort of month, as we were wrapping this up and getting it out the door, previewed these recommendations and findings to Border Patrol or CBP itself, though. It would be, I look forward to doing that. Again, to see what passes the lab test with them and what doesn't, what they think we missed. They've also had a lot of managerial changes in the last month as well, but I look forward to doing that. Anybody else want to grab? Oh, I'll read the other question too, if you want to do both. And the other is anyone enforcing violations of one agent versus another, asked Beryl Flom. And I can talk about that because there's some cases in our database, but if you want to talk about CBP and Border Patrol interactions, go ahead. Anything else?
Go for it, Adam.
Okay. Is anyone enforcing violations of one agent versus another? Not in a public way have we seen real cases of this. Some of you might have seen in 2022, the Project on Government Oversight revealed that the Inspector General had been sitting on an internal survey of all DHS, but mainly the law enforcement agencies, about sexual harassment, finding, and I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but a shockingly high percentage of respondents had said that they had suffered or witnessed sexual harassment or even sexual abuse at the hands of their coworkers, and that most said that they feared or didn't see any point in going public with it or filing a complaint or using the internal process. That survey was mainly in 2018, 2019, so not in ancient history. It's still, that is still a big problem on the inside. There are a couple of cases in the database of agents and officers talking about racist behavior at the hands of personnel in the agency. And you need to look no further than the book published last year by retired agent Jen Budd, who talks about suffering rape and other constant sexual harassment when she was an agent for 7 years. And again, in no case there was anybody held accountable. It is a problem. And we do hear just, often just from revelations here and there about settlements and, out of court payments being made. But there is no, that's as close as most people seem to get to, justice in these cases, at least that we know about in the public record. Susie Pringer asked, what recommendations do you have to provide a copy of this to congressional representatives? And timing, I have no hope of positive responses from my Nebraska delegation, but they must hear this. Vicky at Human Rights Watch asked, what are next steps and how can we help? Estelle McLaughlin, what's the name of that book by the female Border Patrol officer? It is called Against the Wall, by Jen with 2 N's, Bud with 2 D's. And it came out in the middle of last year, and I highly recommend it. Before I move on to other questions, I mean, that we have 2 questions about next steps and legislative recommendations. KBI, do you want to jump on either of those?
Yeah, those are great questions. I appreciate it. I think just anyone who's a constituent, any delegation talking to their representatives about this issue is a great place to start. I think that's where we're at still. I'm like trying to understand this process. I mean, we've worked hard to kind of get this all in one place that more or less outlines the process and some of the failure points that we see. But as Adam alluded to, any members of Congress who are interested and willing to talk more publicly about this issue, to ask questions in public arenas such as congressional hearings is definitely going to be helpful. There are some more nitty-gritty things as well that specific members of Congress could push on. For example, Adam mentioned this really outdated management directive that's supposed to talk more about the jurisdictions. Any pressure we can get to get that revised could be one really specific and more nitty-gritty step that could potentially help in this process. Those are the things that immediately come to mind. I don't know if Joanna, if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, I would encourage you to not give up hope on your Nebraska delegation. We intentionally tried to frame the report in a way that you could be really supportive of Border Patrol and believe, that this is a good step forward for the agency. And there's ways to talk about the report and try to use some of that language in the report to help you talk with the Nebraska congressional delegation. Maybe the best approach is not saying, we want to get rid of Border Patrol. The best approach is saying, especially for those kinds of delegations, is to say, look, we believe that Border Patrol can do a better job, and this is going to be to the benefit of all those good agents that work in the agency, so that they're not thrown in with the bad actors. And so I'd encourage you to think about talking about it from that perspective. And I think it's a unique opportunity to reach out to offices that really aren't hearing from their constituents about this issue. Sometimes that can pique interest in a unique way, and especially help us move forward those technical fixes that we're suggesting and ways that Congress can intervene. And I would encourage you to share with them the executive summary as well, because I'm not sure that they'll work through the whole report.
I mean, a couple of notes on next steps. I mean, for Congress, yeah, I mean, what Joanna and Zoe just said, absolutely. I mean, it's in terms of legislative changes, again, you can't get 60 votes in the Senate, so it's hard to really push for something other than in a real future looking way, like let's do this in a few years. But fully funding all 4 of these agencies, as dysfunctional as they can be sometimes, quite often they're dysfunctional because everybody's caseloads are so high because they're understaffed and under-equipped. So that is hugely important. And again, Congress has the power to ask questions and try to get answers. CBP will always be more responsive to a member of Congress, especially an appropriator or somebody like that, than to an NGO. Another big next step as we move toward trying to get some of these other parts of this working is, I think we need to all be filing more complaints and documenting this better. We need KBIs all along the border. That is an ask for philanthropy. We do need the philanthropy community to make this more of a priority, accountability and improvement of our own border agencies' behaviors, so that there can be more advocacy for victims who actually want to move cases forward. There are areas of the border in our database that are just woefully undercovered and it's not because the NGOs there don't care. It's because if you're in a place like Tamaulipas, Mexico, you're busy with a security situation, you're busy with a huge migrant flow. There's not a lot of funding and assistance, and nobody can cover it. So that's another way forward is for the philanthropic community. Wow, a lot of questions. So you guys can read these as well as I can, but maybe not everybody can. Who do you
I'll jump
recommend?
in really quickly.
Sure, please.
Well, I don't know if I'm going in order, but just to point out that we do have the abridged versions of the report available on WOLA's website. We're working on getting it by KBIs as well. So if that's more useful to folks, please look at the abridged version. We do have an abridged version available in Spanish as well. And I see a comment that it would be great to have this sort of presentation for a Spanish speaking audience as well. I would love to look into that. I hope we can make that happen because it's absolutely important information that needs to be shared as widely as possible. So I'm seeing those two. I'm also seeing that we have seen in Arizona, migrants who are being kept outside in the extreme summer temperatures that we're seeing. It's happening in Arizona and our complaints are falling on deaf ears. Yes, I have of it at the very least, but it's a great point of how, and I don't know if I have the answer of how can folks use these complaint systems if you're not either the one directly experiencing the abuse or the one kind of filing the complaint on behalf of someone. And I don't know if I have an answer to that. If you are someone who's just aware of this or seeing it, can we use those complaint systems? I don't know if Adam or Joanna know anything about that.
I mean, there was also a question here about Arizona, other groups in Arizona. I think Josh Utter asked this, who are monitoring and working on abuses. Arizona, you do have, say, ACLU of Arizona, always on behalf of people, but not necessarily people who are willing to come forward all the time. Really took the lead last summer on CBP and Border Patrol's confiscation of Sikh people's turbans and other religious items. And they didn't need a lot of migrants to come forward and like put their signatures on forms and stuff like that, and use that. They didn't always technically use the complaints process either. A lot of that was direct letter writing and a very public campaign, but there are ways to do it. But yeah, of course, it's always, you know, if you actually have the ultimate witness is the victim, if the victim is willing to come forward, it probably goes a lot more smoothly. There's a question about, are there many whistleblowers within CBP and DHS who file complaints? We don't have a lot of visibility on that because they don't air that dirty laundry in public. Often when somebody files a complaint on the inside, we do not hear, just judging from the annual disciplinary reports, a lot of cases, particularly about use of force or other improper behavior that actually lead to firings and suspensions every year. So that leads me to believe that a lot of that is not quite happening. Maybe a lot of people are getting, you know, assigned to maybe counselings or very light punishments as a result of these internal whistleblower complaints. I don't have it in front of me, but I do know that a group in San Diego was talking recently about Border Patrol whistleblowers being frustrated in that sector because a lot of what they were saying was not getting anywhere. But now I'm just talking about a tweet I saw that I don't have in front of my face, so I shouldn't get too into detail about that. But it does happen, and I do think that there is probably a similar level of frustration.
And one thing that I would say on that is we do have one example where it seems that there was somebody internal that flagged an incident. I don't know if it was an official complaint or not. And so OPR was already aware of the incident when we then filed the complaint on behalf of the individual. So OPR had opened the case but didn't know who the affected individual was. And when we filed it, then they were able to put the two pieces together. And that helped the case move more quickly than other cases that we'd seen. And I don't think that that's happening commonly, but to emphasize that it is really important to shore up those internal whistleblowers. And if the system worked more in their favor, and maybe we would start to see more of those instances.
I think we have probably time to do maybe one. There is one last question. Can someone talk about Indigenous people cases? I'm sure you've filed some, and we have that if you look at victims on the right column of our database, Indigenous is unfortunately a pretty robust category as well.
Yeah, I have one example. I mean, just thinking about language justice issues, this definitely comes in here. There was someone that came to KBI after being pretty egregiously physically abused at the point of encounter. He is a Spanish speaker. He's from Guatemala, but his native language is his Indigenous language. He was able to have an interview with an OPR agent that was in Spanish, but our staff's observations, because a staff member was able to accompany him, unfortunately, our staff observed that the OPR agent who spoke Spanish was not a native Spanish speaker. And also the person impacted was an Indigenous Malay speaker. So we could perceive that there was not a high level of communication and understanding back and forth. So I think that's a great point as far as actual meaningful language justice for people who speak languages other than Spanish, especially Indigenous languages, is going to be a part of having a strong and effective investigation, that you're actually able to communicate with someone in the language that they prefer. So that's an example that immediately comes to mind, and definitely is an important advocacy issue to continue pushing on as well.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks to everyone who attended and listened to this briefing. I'm glad that we had a good turnout because it is an important issue, and one that I wish was getting more attention. And, we're doing our best here, and we will continue to do our best. And we really appreciate our colleagues at the Kena Border Initiative for being with us on this report. I look forward to doing more with you in the future and getting back to Nogales and seeing you. So, I guess as a final note, just again, WOLA.org. Right now, you can find it's right there on the front page, abuses at the U.S.-Mexico border. If you're viewing this YouTube video later, you'll have to Google abuses at the U.S.-Mexico border, WOLA, and it's on KBI's page as well as the PDF, Kena Borders Initiative's website. We also have it in regular sort of web HTML version divided into several sections if you prefer to read that way, giant PDF, and then there is an abridged version for those who don't want to wade through all of the examples. That's about 10 or 11 pages long. Y también hay una versión abreviada en español, en PDF, but we do not have the whole thing in Spanish. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Joanna. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be in touch. Feel free